The office smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. That particular combination had followed Leah Vance through 11 different placements, 4 group homes and 2 emergency shelters over the course of her life. It was the official smell of the system, the smell of fluorescent lights and manila folders, and people who meant well but couldn't quite look you in the eye when they handed you your future in a brown envelope. She sat on the edge of a vinyl chair across from Ms. Patricia Drummond, who had been her caseworker for the last 2 years and who was now looking at her with the careful, practiced expression of someone delivering news they had delivered many times before. The chair sighed every time Leah shifted her weight. She had stopped shifting. Today was her 18th birthday. It wasn't a celebration, it was a checkout. Ms. Drummond slid a thick brown envelope across the desk. It stopped in front of Leah with the quiet finality of a period at the end of a very long sentence. Leah's name was typed on the front in clean black letters. Leah Vance. Inside was her birth certificate, her social security card, and a cashier's check for $21,241. The balance of her state-managed savings account. Every birthday check from distant relatives who felt guilty, every small deposit from the part-time job she'd held at the grocery store for 14 months, every cent she had accumulated while the state held it in trust. It was everything she owned in the world, and it fit inside a single envelope. She looked at it without touching it. "There's one more thing," Ms. Drummond said. Her voice was gentle in the way that institutional voices become gentle over years of practice. She reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and produced a second envelope. This one was older. The paper had gone soft and yellow at the corners, the way paper does when it has been sitting in a drawer for a very long time, waiting for the right moment. "This was left in your file 8 years ago," Ms. Drummond said. "It came through a family law attorney. The instructions were specific. It was to be given to you on your 18th birthday, but only under the condition that you were not in the custody of your mother." Leah looked at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she did not immediately recognize. Shaky, deliberate letters, the kind made by hands that were more comfortable holding tools than pens. "It's from your grandfather," Ms. Drummond said quietly. "Walter Vance." The name landed somewhere deep and strange in Leah's chest. Walter. She had almost no memory of him. A ghost assembled from fragments. The rough texture of a flannel shirt. The sound of wood being worked in a garage somewhere. A smell clean and warm like sawdust and linseed oil. He had died when she was 10 years old, a year before her mother's problems became too large and too loud for their apartment to contain. A year before Leah ended up in her first group home. She had been told at the time that he was gone. She had been 10, and she had not fully understood what gone meant, not the permanent kind, not yet. "He arranged something through the attorney," Ms. Drummond continued. "A property transfer. A small parcel of land out in the high desert, San Bernardino County. There's a structure on it. A barn, I think. The deed transfer was prepaid years ago. The only cost to you is the county filing fee." She slid a small receipt across the desk. $4, Ms. Drummond said. "I took care of it for you. It's yours now officially." Leah picked up the receipt. $4. She turned it over in her fingers. She had been prepared for a lot of things today. She had been preparing for this day for 2 years, quietly, methodically, the way she did most things. She had thought about the shelter on Fletcher Avenue, which had a 6-week program for aging out foster youth. She had thought about the grocery store, whether they would give her more hours. She had thought about the community college 2 bus lines away and the enrollment deadlines she had already looked up. She had not thought about land. She had not thought about a barn. She had certainly not thought about $4 buying her anything that mattered. She set the receipt down and picked up the old envelope. Inside was a single heavy brass key and a folded piece of paper. The note was short. The handwriting was the same shaky, deliberate script from the outside of the envelope, and Leah read it slowly, the way you read something when you want to make sure you understand every word before you move to the next one. "Leah, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and things did not go the way I prayed they would. I am sorry for that. This key opens a lockbox under the 3rd floorboard to the left of the main barn door. What is inside is the real inheritance. Do not let them take the land. It is more important than it looks. Be strong, I love you. Your Gramps. She read it twice, she read it a third time. The words blurred slightly. Not because she was crying, though something in her chest was doing something she did not have an immediate name for. They blurred because of the last four words. Your Gramps. 2 years in a group home and 1 year in a foster placement that ended badly had not produced those words from a single adult. Not directed at her. Not in that particular uncomplicated way that meant the person saying them had nothing to gain from the saying. She folded the note carefully and put it back in the envelope with the key. Ms. Drummond was watching her with that careful professional expression, but underneath it was something more human. Concern, maybe. Or something that had once been concern and had gotten tired over the years, but was still trying. The address is on the deed, Ms. Drummond said. It's remote. There's a bus that goes to a town about 5 miles from the property. From what I can gather, there's no running water or electricity out there. It's been vacant for a long time. She paused. Leah, be careful. The world can be difficult. But you are a good person. You have a good heart. Don't let anyone take that from you. Leah stood up and put both envelopes into the thin backpack that held everything she owned. 2 changes of clothes, a worn paperback she had read 4 times, a toothbrush, a small notebook she had been writing in since she was 15, because writing things down was how she kept the inside of her head organized. She said thank you. She meant it. Then she walked out. The city outside was doing what cities always did, which was everything at once and at full volume. Traffic and sirens and the particular compressed energy of 1 million people existing in close proximity to each other. Leah stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it wash over her. For 18 years, she had been a passenger in her own life, moved from one place to another by decisions made in offices like the one she had just left, by paperwork and assessments and the slow grinding machinery of a system that was trying its best but was also fundamentally not hers. The driver's seat was empty now. She could go anywhere. She went to the Greyhound station. The bus left at 4 in the afternoon and arrived in Amboy, California just before 7 the following morning. 14 hours. Leah had a window seat, and she used every minute of it watching the city give way to suburbs. The suburbs dissolve into highway, the highway narrow and flatten as the world opened up into something vast and pale, and almost impossibly quiet-looking from behind glass. The Mojave at dawn was the color of old bone, the Joshua trees standing in their strange, twisted postures against a sky just beginning to go pink at the edges. She thought about Walter while she watched the desert. She tried to build him from what little she had, the flannel shirt, the sawdust smell. She had a memory vague and uncertain of sitting on a wooden step somewhere and watching a man's hands move over a piece of wood with a plane the long, slow strokes producing thin curls that fell to the ground like pale ribbons. She did not know if the memory was real or if she had constructed it from things she had been told. That was the problem with memories from when you were very young. They became stories you told yourself until you could no longer tell the difference between what you had seen and what you had imagined. Her mother had been Walter's daughter. That much Leah knew. She knew her mother's problems had started before she was born and gotten worse in increments too small to notice until they were too large to fix. She did not blame her mother exactly. She had spent a long time working out how she felt about her mother, and she had arrived at something that was not quite blame and not quite forgiveness, but existed somewhere in the complicated middle territory between them. Her mother had not been able to be what Leah needed. That was a fact. The reasons behind the fact were sad and human and not entirely her mother's fault. Both of those things were true at the same time. The bus pulled into Amboy just as the sun was clearing the horizon. Amboy was not so much a town as a memory of a town. A cluster of sun-bleached buildings arranged around a 2-lane highway that went in 2 directions and appeared to go a very long way in both. A gas station, an abandoned motel whose sign had lost most of its letters, a building that might have been a diner once. The silence was so complete when the bus pulled away that Leah could hear the blood moving in her ears. She was the only passenger who got off. The air was thin and dry and already warm, even at that early hour, with a mineral clarity to it that was nothing like the thick, recycled air of the city. She stood at the edge of the highway with her backpack and her $4 deed and her grandfather's brass key and looked at the two directions the road offered. The map that Miss Drummond had printed for her showed the property 5 miles north down a dirt road that started behind the abandoned motel. 5 miles. She had walked 5 miles before. She bought a gallon of water and 2 packages of beef jerky from the gas station, where a teenage boy behind the counter looked at her with mild curiosity and said nothing, and then she started walking. The dirt road was pale and powdery, the kind of fine desert dust that coated everything it touched and worked its way into every fold of fabric and every crack and dry skin. The sun climbed while she walked, and the heat climbed with it. She watched a lizard move across the road in that quick, liquid way lizards have there, and then gone, and a hawk turned slow circles overhead. Otherwise, there was nothing, just the road and the scrub and the enormous, uncomplicated sky. She told herself not to expect anything. She had learned that lesson early. The spaces between what you were told something would be and what it actually was had been the architecture of most of her disappointments, and she had grown practiced at not filling those spaces with hope before they were earned. A barn, Ms. Drummond had said. A parcel, remote, no water, no electricity. Those were the facts. She moved through them one at a time and did not add anything to them that wasn't there. She saw the shape of it from the top of a low rise silhouetted against the sky. It was worse than she had prepared for. The wood had gone the color of old pewter silver gray and deeply weathered, split in long vertical lines where decades of sun and wind had worked at it. The roof sagged in the middle, a tired concave curve that told her the structural members had given way somewhere underneath. Several panels of corrugated tin had been torn loose and either blown away or were lying somewhere in the scrub. Tumbleweeds had piled against the base of the walls, and thorny bushes had colonized the ground around it in thick, impassable clusters. There was no house, no fence, no water tank, no utility pole, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here in a very long time. Just this one building standing in the middle of a lot of nothing, looking like it was considering whether to fall down. Leah stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a long time. She did not feel what she had been bracing herself not to feel, which was crushing disappointment. What she felt was harder to name. Something quieter. This place was hers. That was a fact she had not fully processed until this moment standing in front of it. It was broken and neglected and in a condition that a reasonable person would describe as beyond saving. And it was hers. Entirely and completely and without qualification. No caseworker, no placement coordinator, no house rules posted on a refrigerator that wasn't her refrigerator in a kitchen that wasn't her kitchen. Hers. She pushed through the scrub to the front doors. They were massive, wide enough to drive a tractor through, and they hung on rusted hinges at slightly wrong angles, one of them ajar by several inches. She squeezed through the gap and let her eyes adjust to the interior. The inside was vast in the way old agricultural buildings are vast, built for a scale of work that most people don't do anymore. The ceiling, what was left of it, was 30 feet overhead. Shafts of dusty light came down through the holes in the roof and illuminated the air, which was thick with suspended particles that moved in slow, eddying currents. The smell was dry rot and ancient hay, and something else underneath both of those, something clean and mineral, the smell of undisturbed earth. The floor near the entrance was wood. The rest was packed dirt. She stood in the doorway and let the space settle around her, and then she walked to the wooden section and knelt down. Third floorboard to the left of the main barn door. She counted. 1, 2, 3. She ran her fingers along the edge of the third board. It was thick and heavy, lay close to its neighbors, the cracks packed with decades of compacted dust. No handle, no obvious seam. She used the edge of the brass key to work at the packed dust in the crack, pressing and dragging until a thin line appeared. Then she gripped the end of the board with both hands and pulled. The wood groaned. She adjusted her grip and pulled again, putting her weight into it, and with a sound like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time, finally letting go, the end of the board came up. She reached into the dark space beneath. Her fingers found cold metal. She pulled it out. It was a military ammunition box, the kind that had been made by the hundreds of thousands and had ended up in garages and attics and barn floors all over the country. Olive green, solid heavy. On the front, stenciled in faded white paint that had mostly flaked away but was still legible, Vance. On the side was a heavy padlock. She took the brass key from her pocket. Her hand was shaking in a way she observed with some detachment, as if it belonged to someone else. She got the key into the lock on the third try and turned it. The mechanism moved with a deep, solid click that echoed slightly in the cathedral space of the barn. She lifted the latch, opened the lid. It was not what she expected. She had not let herself expect anything in particular. But if she was honest, the small part of her that had allowed itself a little hope had been thinking of something small. A ring, a watch, something that had belonged to someone she was supposed to have known better. The kind of inheritance that fit in a jewelry box and got passed down because there was nothing else to pass. What she found instead was paper and metal and the smell of something that had been sealed away from the air for a long time. The box was filled with letters, stacks of them, bound with lengths of brown twine that had dried and gone brittle. And on top of the letters was a large manila envelope, thicker and heavier than it had any right to be. She lifted it out, tore it open. The bills were bundled in paper wrappers, hundreds, and there were a lot of them. She counted slowly and carefully, her lips moving. $10,000. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was in her hands and said nothing because there was nothing to say. $10,000. To her at this moment in this empty barn in the middle of the Mojave, it was a sum so far outside her daily reality that it did not feel real. It felt like something from a different register of existence. Beneath the money was a piece of graph paper folded into quarters. She opened it. A hand-drawn diagram, the lines done carefully in pencil, the kind of careful that comes from a person who is used to making technical drawings, who knows that the lines need to mean something. The diagram showed a cross-section of the barn from the side. Beneath the barn floor, a second space had been drawn, accessed by a set of stairs. The space below had walls that were cross-hatched, the notation for concrete. The roof of the lower space was drawn with short diagonal lines and a small annotation in cramped handwriting. Leah tilted the paper toward the light coming in from above. The annotation said, "South-facing 34 degrees." At the bottom of the page, her grandfather had written two words, "Walipini, build this." She did not know what the word meant. She set the diagram aside and picked up the first bundle of letters. They were addressed to her. The dates went back 8 years to the year Walter died. He had been writing to her from the year he died, which meant he had written them before he died, accumulated them, arranged for someone to keep them, and put them in this box where she would find them when she was old enough to find them. She untied the twine on the first bundle and opened the letter on top. The handwriting was the same deliberate, shaky script from the envelope, but with more of the shake in it. The letters formed with the concentrated effort of someone for whom writing had become difficult. My dearest Leah, if you are reading this, I am so sorry. I am sorry I was not there to see you grow into the person I always knew you would be. I am sorry for what your mother put you through. None of it was your fault. You were a good kid, the best kid a woman could ask for a granddaughter. I want you to know that. I want that to be the first thing you read. She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and looked up at the shafts of dusty light coming through the ruined roof and breathed carefully for a moment. Then she kept reading. His life unfolded across the pages. He had been a carpenter all his working life, self-taught, skilled with his hands, in the way that people of his generation were often skilled practically and without ceremony. He had served during his early 20s, come home to a country that was busy with other things, and fit himself back into civilian life with the quiet determination of a man who had decided not to carry what he'd seen if he could help it. He had met Leah's grandmother at a church social in 1962. He had built furniture for their first apartment because they could not afford to buy it. He had been happy in the way that people are happy when they have enough and know it. Then he wrote about the land. I bought this piece of nothing in 1996, he wrote in a letter from 3 months before he died. Everyone thought I was losing my mind. Your grandmother, God rest her soul, she called it my dirt farm. But I saw something out here, Leah. I saw a place where a man could think, where a person could put something in the ground and watch it come back up. I was going to build a small house here, for me and your grandmother to retire in. Then she got sick, and the medical bills took everything we had saved, and this piece of land was all that was left. Paid for free and clear. That turned out to be the most important thing. He wrote about her birth. He wrote about her mother's slow deterioration, the addiction that had started as something that could be explained away and had grown over years into something that could not. He had tried to help. He had paid for 2 rehabilitation programs. He had driven his daughter to appointments and sat in waiting rooms and done everything a father could do, and it had not been enough. And he had made his peace with that fact in the slow, painful way that people make peace with things they cannot change. I knew she was going to lose you, he wrote. I could see it happening. I did not know when, but I knew it was coming. And I knew I did not have much time left myself. The doctors gave me less than a year. So I made a plan. It was not a good plan, not a clean one, and I am not proud of every part of it. But it was the only plan I had, and I made it for you. Leah set the letter down. She looked at the stacks of remaining letters, the bound bundles of 8 years of a dead man's thoughts, and she understood that what she was holding was not just an explanation. It was a reckoning. Whatever her grandfather had done with the time he had left, he had done it knowing it needed to be explained, knowing she would need to understand it before she could decide what to do with it. She opened the next letter. He wrote about a man named Earl Briggs. They had served together, she gathered, not in the same unit, but in adjacent ones, and they had known each other the way men know each other when they have been through something that does not have an adequate civilian equivalent. Briggs, he called him Sarge, had come home from his service and had a harder time of it than Walter had. He had gotten into trouble. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that made the news, but the slow, grinding kind that happens when a man has poor judgment about who to trust and borrows money from people who are not banks and who do not have the same expectations about repayment terms. By the time Walter found out how bad it was, Briggs owed money to men who were not going to wait for it. The kind of men who made their point with something other than letters. I could not let that happen, Walter wrote. He saved my life once. Not in any heroic way, not the way people imagine when they hear something like that. He was just paying attention when I was not, and he pulled me back from something stupid, and I walked away from it. But walking away from something stupid has consequences that compound over time, and what those consequences amounted to over 50 years was my life, the one I got to have. I owed him that same chance. So I went to the men he owed. I told them I had land. I told them I knew how to build things. I told them I could give them something they needed. What they needed was a place, somewhere to keep things they did not want other people to know about. Off the books, off the grid, not connected to any name that could be traced. I told them I could build that. Underground. Concrete walls, proper ventilation, a hidden entrance. I told them I would build it on my land in the desert where no one ever went. They laughed at me at first. I do not blame them for that. I was an old man making them a strange offer. But I was serious, and eventually they understood that I was serious, and we made a deal. The terms were this. I would build them their storage space. In exchange, they would forgive Briggs's debt and leave him alone forever. And they could use the space for 20 years, after which they would clear it out and walk away and never come back. The land and everything on it would go to my estate, to you. They had no interest in owning land. Their names on a deed created exactly the kind of paper trail they spent their lives avoiding. They just wanted the space. So the ownership was never a question. The $10,000 in the box is what they paid me for the construction work. I want to be honest with you about what that money is. It is payment from criminals for a job I did for them. I am not proud of it. I spent the last year of my life digging that space out of the ground, mostly by hand, because I was too sick to work quickly and too stubborn to stop. I poured the concrete and built the walls and sealed the door and handed over the key, and I told myself I was doing it for you. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was also true that I was doing it because I did not know what else to do, and doing something felt better than doing nothing. Both things can be true. The 20-year agreement ends in 2016. I will be gone before then. What I do not know and what I cannot control from wherever I am going is whether they will honor the agreement and clear out when they are supposed to. I hope they will. I believe they will. These are men who operate on the basis of deals made and deals kept, because their whole world depends on people believing that a deal with them means something. But I cannot be certain, and that is why I am telling you not to let them take the land. Whatever happens, whatever they tell you, whatever they offer you, do not sell it and do not walk away from it. What I built for them is underground and sealed, and not your concern. What I want you to build is something different. He described the Walipini in the next letter. He had read about them, he said, in an old book about sustainable agriculture that he had found in a library, very much like the kind she might find in any small desert town. The word came from a South American language, he explained, and it referred to a pit greenhouse, a structure built by excavating down into the earth and using the thermal mass of the surrounding soil to maintain a stable growing temperature year-round, even in extreme climates. In the desert, where the surface temperature could kill most plants for months at a time, you could dig down 8 feet and find a microclimate that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer, that held moisture and blocked wind, that turned an environment hostile to life into one that could sustain it. I drew you a plan, he wrote. It is in the box with this letter. The south slope of the barn site gets good light, and the barn itself will serve as a windbreak. The diagram shows you the dimensions and the roof angle and the drainage configuration. I could not build it myself. I was too sick and too busy with the other thing. But I want you to build it. I want you to take that dirty money and use it to make something grow. That is the only way I know to make what I did mean something better than what it was. He wrote more letters after that one. He wrote about the particular quality of light in the desert at different times of year. He wrote about the soil composition and what it would need to become productive. He wrote about the water table and the best locations for a cistern. He had done careful research in the months between his diagnosis and his death, and he had put what he learned into letters addressed to a granddaughter he would not live to see read them. It was an act of such deliberate and patient love that Leah had to stop several times and breathe carefully before she could continue. The last letter in the stack was short. The handwriting was significantly worse, the letters uneven, the pressure on the pen inconsistent. He had written it close to the end. I am tired now. The work is done. The desert will fight you. It fought me too. There were nights I sat out there next to that hole in the ground and thought I had made every wrong decision a man could make. Then the sun came up and the hole was still there, and I went back to it. That is all it takes sometimes, just going back to it. I hope you can forgive me for the choices I made. I hope you choose the harder right over the easier wrong. That was something I failed at more times than I succeeded. Do better than me. I love you, Leah. Your Gramps. She sat on the packed earth floor of the barn for a long time after she finished reading. The sun had moved while she was reading, and the shafts of light through the broken roof were at different angles, now the dust still moving in them in that slow, patient way. Her back was against the wall, and the letters were spread around her, and the brass key was in her hand, and the $10,000 was in the envelope in her lap. She cried. She had not cried in a long time. Not the real kind, not the kind that comes from somewhere below the level where you can manage things. She had gotten very good at managing things, but there was nothing to manage about this. A man she had barely known had spent the last year of his dying building something in the ground so that she would have a chance he was not going to be alive to give her in person. He had called her the best kid a woman could ask for a granddaughter. He had told her he loved her in writing so that she would have it permanently, so it could not be taken back or qualified or explained away. She let herself cry for a while. Then she stopped because that was also something she had gotten good at, knowing when it was done. Outside, the sun was going toward the horizon and the desert was turning the color of copper and rust. She had two options. She could take the $10,000 and the $21,000 in her bank account and find her way back to the highway and start a different kind of life. Nobody would ever know. The land would go back to being empty, and whatever was in the bunker underneath it would stay there. And the men who had made the deal with her grandfather would either come back or they wouldn't. And either way, it would not be her problem. Or she could stay. She could honor what the man who called himself her Gramps had asked her to do with what little he'd had to leave her. She could take the dirty money and wash it clean with dirt and water and work. She could build what was on the diagram. She could find out what the word Walipini meant in practice, in the actual resistant earth of a place that did not easily give itself to anything. She looked at the brass key in her hand. She looked at the diagram, the careful pencil lines and notation at the bottom in her grandfather's handwriting. She looked at the stacks of letters, 8 years of a man talking to a girl he was afraid would never be told that she was loved. She put everything back in the box. She put the box back under the floorboard. She lay her backpack against the wall and rolled out the thin emergency sleeping bag she had bought at the Greyhound Station gift shop for $11, and she lay down on the floor of her barn. The wind moved through the gaps in the walls and made sounds that were almost like voices. The dark came down fast the way it does in the desert, sudden and total, and the stars came out in numbers that she had never seen from any window in any city. Through a gap in the roof above her, she could see a stripe of them, the Milky Way visible as an actual structure, a river of cold light crossing the dark. She lay on her back and looked at the stars through the broken roof of the barn that belonged to her, that had always been meant to belong to her, that a dying man had held in place with deals he was not proud of, because he needed it to still be there when she was old enough to find it. In the morning, she decided she would walk back to town. She would find a library. She would learn what the word Walipini meant in terms she could act on. She would buy a shovel. She would stay. She bought the shovel at 7:15 in the morning from a hardware store on the main road through Amboy that she had not noticed the night before because she had been too tired and too full of everything she had read to notice much of anything. The store was narrow and deep and smelled of machine oil and sawdust, which she recognized from the small fragment of memory she had of her grandfather. And the man behind the counter was somewhere in his late 60s, with a face that had been worked over by decades of desert sun until it had the texture of old leather. He wore a faded cap with no logo on it, and he looked at her the way people in small towns look at strangers, which is to say, completely and without any pretense of not doing it. His name, she would learn later, was Gareth Holt. He said nothing while she moved through his store collecting what she needed. A long-handled shovel with a fiberglass shaft, a mattock for breaking hardpan, a pair of leather work gloves, the real kind, not the thin cotton ones, a folding knife, a headlamp, a 5-gallon water jug. She set everything on the counter and he looked at the pile and then he looked at her. "You the one who bought the old Vance place," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he started ringing things up without further comment. When she paid, he put the change on the counter rather than in her hand, which was not unfriendly exactly, just reserved in the way of a man who had not yet decided what he thought about something. She loaded everything into her backpack as best she could and carried the shovel and the mattock over one shoulder and walked the 5 miles back to the barn. By the time she arrived, the sun was already high enough to mean business, and her shirt was soaked through, and the leather of the new gloves was stiff against her palms. She dropped everything at the edge of the scrub and stood with her hands on her knees and breathed for a moment. Then she looked at the barn and the land around it, and she began to think seriously about what she was going to do. The Walipini had to go on the south side. The diagram was clear about that. The barn itself would serve as the north wall, blocking the prevailing winds and absorbing heat during the day to release it through the night. She paced out the footprint her grandfather had drawn 20 feet wide and 40 feet long, marking the corners with stakes she cut from a dead mesquite branch and tied with the twine from the letter bundles. She walked the perimeter twice, looking at the ground, trying to see what was underneath it. The scrub had to go first. She started at the northeast corner and worked her way around the perimeter, hacking at the base of each bush with the mattock and levering the root ball up with the shovel. The thorny bushes were deceptive low and compact above ground, but anchored by root systems that went down 2 and 3 feet into the desert hardpan, which was exactly as hard as the name suggested. The mattock rang off it like she was hitting concrete. By noon, she had cleared maybe a tenth of the perimeter, and both her palms were bleeding where the new leather had raised blisters and then opened them. She wrapped her hands with strips torn from her second spare shirt and kept going. In the late afternoon, she walked back to Amboy and used the computer at the library to look up Walipini construction. The library was a single room attached to the back of the town hall, and it smelled of old paper and a lemon-scented cleaner that someone applied with great enthusiasm. The only other person in it was the librarian, a woman of about 60 with white hair cut close to her head and reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the precise economical movements of someone who had learned long ago how to do a great deal in a small space. Her name was Willa Avery. She looked up when Leah came in and took in the dust-covered clothes and the wrapped hands and the expression of someone who has been thinking hard about a practical problem and needs information to think harder. She did not ask any intrusive questions. She simply said, "Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking for books on underground greenhouse construction," Leah said, "and earthworks, drainage, concrete foundation work." Willa Avery looked at her for a moment with what might have been surprise, and then directed her to a shelf in the back corner where a collection of books on sustainable agriculture and off-grid building had been sitting largely undisturbed since the early 1980s. Some of them were so old the spines were held together with tape. Leah sat down at the reading table and opened the first one, and began to take notes in her small notebook with the methodical focus of someone who already knows the general shape of what they're trying to do and just needs the specific dimensions. She spent 3 hours reading and writing, and when she left, she had 6 pages of notes, and Willa Avery had not interrupted her once, which she found she was grateful for in a way that was difficult to articulate. She came back the next day, and the day after that. On the fourth day, Willa set a stack of additional books on the table beside her. Without being asked, books she had clearly identified as relevant, and pulled herself. And she said, "I grew up on a farm in Eastern Oregon. I know something about building in hostile country if you ever want to talk through what you're planning." Leah looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "I might take you up on that." She did eventually. But not yet. There was work to do first. The clearing took a full week. 7 days of hacking and levering and hauling the thorny scrub piled at the perimeter of the cleared area in mounds that she would burn later when the fire risk was lower. Her hands progressed from blisters to raw skin to something that was neither a toughened layer, that was not quite callous yet, but was getting there. Her back, which had never been asked to do anything like this, went through its own progression from ache to agony to a kind of deep, persistent soreness that she learned to work through by moving slowly in the morning and faster as the day went on. But with every bush she cleared, with every square foot of ground, she opened up the space felt more hers. She was claiming it in the oldest possible way with her body and her time. When the area was clear, she marked the excavation boundary with stakes and string and stood at the edge of it and looked at it for a long time. 8 feet down, 20 by 40. She had done the math in the library. That was roughly 6,000 cubic feet of desert hardpan that needed to come out of the ground and go somewhere. She had no equipment. She had a shovel, a mattock, a wheelbarrow she had bought on her second trip to Gareth Holt's store, and her own 2 hands. She started digging. The first day of excavation produced a scrape in the ground that was embarrassing in its shallowness. 2 inches deep across the full footprint, maybe with a pile of rocky soil at the edge of the site that looked almost deliberately small, as if the earth was making a point about the ratio of effort to result. She sat at the edge of the scrape at the end of the day with her forearms on her knees and looked at it. She thought about her grandfather, who had been sick and nearly 70 years old, digging by hand in the same ground for a bunker that was substantially larger than what she was building. She thought about him doing it in the knowledge that he was dying and that the thing he was building was not for him. She picked up her shovel and dug until it was too dark to see. Days became a rhythm. She was up before the sun, moving through the lightning gray of early morning, working until the heat peaked around midday, and then resting in the shade of the barn with her books and her notebook, then working again through the afternoon and into the evening. She ate simply beans and rice she cooked over a small camp stove, vegetables from the gas station when she went in for water. She had stopped counting her money after the first week because it made her anxious, and she needed the mental space for other things. Gareth Holt's manner toward her had been shifting in small increments that she tracked without commenting on. The first week he rang her up in silence. The second week he mentioned unprompted that the south-facing slope by the barn would have a hard pan layer about 3 feet down that would need a rock bar to break. The third week he leaned on the counter while she was loading her purchases into her pack and said, "You're still at it." "Still at it," she confirmed. He nodded slowly the way men of his generation sometimes nod when they are updating their assessment of something and want you to know they are doing it, but do not want to say more than necessary about it. On the day she found the bunker entrance, she was not looking for it. She had been clearing the back corner of the barn, moving a pile of old rotted lumber that had been stacked there long enough to have partially merged with the floor, the wood so degraded that it came apart in her hands in soft, damp chunks. She was pulling the last of it away from the wall when her right foot went through the floor with a sudden lurch that sent her hip into the wall and her heart into her throat. She pulled her leg out and looked down. The floorboard she had stepped through was thin with rot, and beneath it was not packed earth. It was empty air. She got down on her knees and carefully broke away the surrounding boards, working slowly, testing each one before she put her weight on it until she had opened a space about 3 feet square. Below the floor was a concrete staircase, steep and narrow, descending into darkness. The air that rose from it was cold and completely still, the kind of cold that belongs to spaces that have not been opened to the surface in a very long time. She pointed her headlamp down. At the bottom of the stairs was a steel door. It was not the door she had been expecting. She was not sure what she had been expecting. Something older, maybe something that matched the vintage of the rest of the barn's construction. This door was modern and heavy institutional gray, with a frame that had been set in the concrete of the stairwell walls with professional precision. And on the door was a deadbolt lock, the industrial kind, the kind with a mechanism that cost several $100s and was not something you bought at a small-town hardware store. She crouched at the top of the stairs and looked at it for a long time. Her grandfather had described sealing the bunker from the outside. He had built it, he had handed over the key to the men who paid him for it, and he had said in his letters that the entrance was secured from the exterior, meaning from this side, meaning that whatever was inside was inaccessible to the people inside it. A one-way arrangement. The lock on the door at the bottom of the stairs was not the lock of a structure sealed from the outside. It was the lock of a structure that someone needed to be able to open and close regularly. It was new enough that the metal still had a sheen to it. Someone had come back, not to clear out, not to honor the terms of the agreement her grandfather had described. Someone had come back to maintain access, to continue using the space long after the 20 years were up. The agreement had ended in 2016. It was 2024. They had been here on her land in a structure under her property for 8 years, past the date they were supposed to be gone. She felt the cold from the stairwell moving up around her like something alive. She went back to the pile of heaviest timber she could find among the barn's salvage, the old growth stuff that had not yet fully rotted, and she hauled it over in armloads and stacked it over the opening. She packed the edges with smaller pieces and weighted the top with a section of the old barn door that she had been using as a workbench surface. When she was done, it looked like a pile of salvaged lumber against the barn wall. It looked like nothing at all. She stood outside in the evening air for a long time and watched the dirt road and the horizon beyond it. A week after she found the bunker entrance, the knife came. She found it in the morning when she went to open the barn doors. It was a folding knife, nothing unusual, the kind of knife that could have been left by anyone. But it was driven point first into the wood of the doorframe at eye height, and impaled on the blade was an envelope. Crisp, white, expensive looking. Inside, the letterhead said Apex Development Holdings, with an address in Las Vegas that she would later learn was a post office box. The letter was brief and professional and offered her $15,000 for the property. It said the offer was valid for 30 days and that they were prepared to move quickly and that they hoped she would find the terms agreeable. She stood in the barn door with the letter in her hand and read it twice. She thought about the sedan she had seen twice now on the dirt road. Dark, late model idling at the far edge of the property for an hour and then gone. She had told herself it was nothing. She did not tell herself that anymore. She tore the letter into pieces and let the desert wind take them. That afternoon, she walked to the library and sat down at the computer and spent 2 hours looking up Apex Development Holdings. What she found was a structure assembled from layers of opacity, a corporation that owned another corporation that was registered at an address that corresponded to a legal services firm that provided registered agent services for several hundred other entities. No physical address, no named principals, no public projects, no record of any development actually developed. Just the legal scaffolding of a company that existed on paper in the way that certain things exist, not to do anything but to hold something for someone who did not want their name on it. She wrote everything down in her notebook. On her next trip to Gareth Holt's store, she was quieter than usual, and he noticed. He had begun to notice things about her in a way that was less assessment and more attention, the way you pay attention to someone once you've decided they are worth paying attention to. He did not ask what was wrong. He waited until she had paid and then said something going on out there. She looked at him for a moment. Then she told him. Not everything, not the letters in the bunker and the full history of what her grandfather had done, but the offer, the knife in the doorframe, the sedan on the road, the shell company with the Las Vegas address. Gareth listened without interrupting, leaning on the counter with his arms crossed, his weathered face giving nothing away. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had made a mistake. Then he said, these Apex people, they've been working this county for a while, buying up parcels out in the desert, mostly from folks who don't have the resources to push back or the information to know they should. There's talk about a resort development out by the dry lake bed, something big, but nobody's seen any permits and nobody's broken ground anywhere. And it's been 5 years of talk. He straightened up. Your grandfather, Walter Vance. I knew him a little. He came in a few times over the years. Quiet man. Good hands, you could tell by looking at them. He helped me out once after a bad storm took part of my roof, showed up with his truck and his tools, and wouldn't take a dollar for it. He paused then and looked at the counter for a moment as if he was deciding something. I saw him once, he said, maybe 2015 or so, talking to a man I didn't recognize out in the parking lot of the gas station. Man in a suit, which was unusual out here. Walter looked uncomfortable. Looked the way a man looks when a conversation is not going the way he wants it to. I didn't ask him about it. I wish I had. He went behind the counter and came back with a business card, the kind that had been in a drawer long enough to have curved edges and a slight fading on the printed side. My nephew, he said. Declan. He practices out of Barstow. Family law mostly, but he knows his way around property disputes, and he's the kind of lawyer who cares whether the right person wins. Tell him his Uncle Gareth sent you. Tell him what you told me. He'll listen. She took the card. She held it for a moment and looked at it. Thank you, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a word and went back to whatever he had been doing. She went back to her excavation. She called Declan Holt from the payphone outside the gas station that afternoon. He had a precise, careful voice, and he listened without interruption, while she gave him the condensed version of what she had, the deed, the shell company, the offer, the surveillance. When she finished, he asked 3 specific questions, and then he said he would look into Apex Development Holdings and get back to her within a week. He said that what she was describing, if accurate, likely constituted harassment and potentially illegal intimidation in a property matter, and that there were legal instruments available to address it. He said pro bono as a matter of course before she could ask about fees. She thanked him and hung up and stood at the payphone for a moment with her hand still on the receiver. Then she went back to the barn and dug for 2 more hours until the light failed. 3 weeks into the excavation, the storm came. A desert storm, the kind that forms with very little warning and arrives with complete conviction, dropping an inch of rain in 40 minutes onto soil that had not absorbed meaningful moisture in months and had no intention of starting now. Leah heard it coming, a low, sustained hiss in the distance that grew to a roar in the time it took her to climb out of the hole and make it to the barn door. She watched from the doorway while the rain hammered the site. The water did not sink into the ground. It ran in sheets across the hard pan surface and into the open excavation and pooled at the bottom. And then, because she had not yet installed the drainage system she had read about in Willa Avery's borrowed books, it had nowhere to go. The walls of the excavation, which she had cut steep and clean over 3 weeks of careful work, softened in the water in the northeast corner, where the soil had a different composition that she had not yet identified as a problem, began to slump. She watched a week of work fold slowly into the bottom of the hole. She stood in the barn doorway with her arms crossed over her chest and watched it and said nothing. The storm passed in less than an hour, the way desert storms do, moving on to somewhere else with the same sudden conviction with which they arrived. The sky cleared to a deep, clean blue. The smell of wet desert earth, petrichor and mineral and something ancient came up from the ground and filled the air with a clarity that was almost painful. She walked to the edge of the excavation and looked down at the damage. The northeast corner had lost about 4 feet of wall height, the soil spreading in a fan across the floor of the hole. 2 to 3 days of digging to restore it, plus the time to install the drainage she should have prioritized before now. It was early evening, though it felt much later. She sat down on the wet ground at the edge of the hole and put her face in her hands. She had known this would be hard. She had prepared herself for hard. But there is a difference between knowing a thing is hard and sitting in wet desert dirt with the evidence of a week's work collapsed in front of you. And the difference was large enough that she let herself inhabit it for a few minutes without trying to manage it. She took her grandfather's last letter from her shirt pocket. She had started carrying it there, the short one, the one written close to the end when his hands were failing. She unfolded it carefully, even though she had it memorized. The desert will fight you. It fought me too. There were nights I sat out there next to that hole in the ground and thought I had made every wrong decision a man could make. Then the sun came up and the hole was still there, and I went back to it. That is all it takes sometimes, just going back to it. She folded the letter and put it back. She went to bed. In the morning, she drove the drainage trench first, before anything else, cutting a perimeter channel at the base of the walls and filling it with gravel from a pile she had been stockpiling at the edge of the site. She installed a simple slope to the south end of the excavation floor. She repaired the collapsed wall. She did not rush, and she did not cut anything she had cut before. It took 4 days. Then she went back to digging down. Marcus Shear arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the knife in the door. She heard the car before she saw it, the sound of tires on the dirt road that had a different quality than the occasional ranch truck or county vehicle. She was in the excavation 8 feet down now, working the south wall, and she climbed out and stood at the edge of the site and watched the black sedan come up the road and park directly in front of the barn doors. 2 men got out. The one who came forward was tall and lean, in his 50s, with the unhurried movement of a person who was accustomed to being the most prepared person in any given situation. His suit was gray and his shoes were polished, and he wore no expression in particular, which was its own kind of expression. The man who stayed by the car was younger and wider and stood with his hands visible and his weight distributed in a way that said he was there for a specific purpose. Marcus Shear. She did not know his name yet. She learned it from Declan later. He looked at the excavation site. He looked at the barn. He looked at her, covered in dirt and holding a rock bar, and he did not change his expression. Leah Vance, he said. She said nothing. He said he represented Apex Development Holdings and that they had sent her a letter some weeks ago, which she had not responded to, and that he was here as a courtesy to deliver a revised offer in person. He said the offer was $20,000, that it was a final offer, and that it reflected the full market value of the parcel, plus a substantial premium for her convenience. He said she should understand that the company had significant interest in the corridor, and that they had both the resources and the patience to pursue acquisition through whatever channels were necessary. He looked at her steadily while he said all of this, in the unhurried tone of a man reciting the terms of something he had recited many times. When he finished, she said, "It's not for sale." He was quiet for a moment. He looked again at the excavation and at the barn, and she could see him calculating something, estimating something. "Your grandfather was a pragmatic man," he said. "He understood the nature of agreements, and he honored the terms of the ones he made. I would hope you've inherited that quality." He let that sit there for a moment, and she understood exactly what it meant. He was telling her that he knew about the arrangement. He was telling her that Walter had made a deal, and that the expectation was that the deal would extend to whoever came after Walter. He was also, she understood, looking for the entrance to the bunker. His eyes moved across the barn interior, across the floor, across the walls. He did not find it. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, which he set on the ground between them, rather than handing it to her. "1 week," he said. Then he turned and walked back to the car without waiting for any response, and the sedan reversed down the dirt road and was gone. She stood there for a moment. Then she picked up the envelope. She did not open it. She walked to the barn and put it on the shelf she had built from salvage lumber near the door, where she put things she needed to deal with later. She went back to the excavation and picked up the rock bar and went down into the hole. She worked until she could not see. That night she sat in the barn with her notebook, and she wrote down everything she could remember about the conversation, the precise words Marcus Shear had used, the specific things he had looked at, what she had been able to determine from his demeanor and his statements. She had read enough in the last weeks about property law on Willa Avery's library computer to know that what was happening to her had a legal shape to it, and that the shape could be addressed. She wrote Declan Holt's number at the top of the page, and she wrote "call tomorrow," and she underlined it twice. Then she opened her grandfather's letters again, and she read through them from the beginning, looking not at the emotional content this time, but at the timeline. He had made the deal in 1996, 20-year agreement, 2016. She was here in 2024, 8 years past the expiration. The deadbolt on the interior door was new. The sedan on the road was not the relic of an old arrangement, but the active presence of an organization still using the space still invested in this location, and now confronted with a complication they had not anticipated when they watched the land sit empty for 8 years after Walter's death. She was the complication. That was a clarifying thought, oddly. They were not threatening her because she was vulnerable. They were threatening her because she was in the way. That was a different thing entirely. On the day she planted the first seeds, the hole was 8 feet deep, and the concrete foundation forms were poured and cured, and the north wall, which used the barn foundation as its structure, was solid and sound. She had built the south, east, and west walls herself from the insulated framing system she had designed, based on Willa's books, working slowly and checking every measurement twice the way her grandfather's letters had led her to understand that careful people built things. The polycarbonate roof panels had arrived 2 days ago on a flatbed truck, the driver looking at the remote site with professional skepticism, and she had spent 36 hours getting them into position and sealed a process that had involved a great deal of creative problem solving, given that she was working alone. She had installed the rainwater collection system from the barn's gutters into the cistern she had placed at the low end of the greenhouse floor. She had brought in 6 yards of compost and topsoil, hauling it in the wheelbarrow from the delivery pile outside the barn, in what she later calculated had been over 200 individual trips. She stood at the top of the stairs leading down into the greenhouse and looked at what she had built. The air inside was different from the air outside in ways that were immediately apparent. Cooler in this late-season heat. Still. The soft, diffused light through the polycarbonate panels was unlike any light she had been in before, neither the flat brightness of the surface nor the darkness of the barn. It was the light of something protected. She went down the stairs with the seed packets she had bought at the gas station. Basic things, tomatoes and lettuces and carrots and herbs. And she knelt in the first bed and pressed the seeds into the dark soil one at a time, with the tip of her finger covering each one carefully. She did not know if they would grow. She had built the structure correctly, she was fairly sure of that. She had prepared the soil. She had the water and the light and the temperature differential that the book said were necessary. But she had never grown anything before in her life. She had grown up in apartments, in group homes, and institutional spaces where things grew in pots on windowsills if they grew at all. The actual relationship between a seed pressed into dark earth and a living plant was something she understood theoretically, but had never witnessed from the beginning. She covered the last seed and sat back on her heels and looked at the long, dark beds stretching the length of the greenhouse. 8 days later, she was down in the greenhouse checking the moisture level in the beds when she saw it. A point of green no larger than the head of a pin pushing up through the dark surface of the soil in the lettuce bed. She was still for a moment. Then she got down on her hands and knees and put her face close to the ground and looked at it directly. It was real. It was alive. It had come up out of the dark on its own, following some instruction written into it before she was born, finding the light she had made a place for it to find. She laughed. It came out of her chest with a force that surprised her, something loosening that had been held in place for a long time. She sat back in the soft dirt of the greenhouse floor and laughed until her eyes were wet. By the following morning, there were more. Thin, pale threads uncurling from the soil all along the lettuce bed, and the first tentative showing of something in the tomato bed that she crouched over for a long time, trying to confirm was real. In the carrot bed, nothing yet but the herbs were showing movement in 2 of the 4 rows. Life was happening here. In the ground she had prepared in the space she had built from a dying man's diagram and a collection of old books in her own hands, life was finding its way up. She was still down in the greenhouse with her face close to the new growth when she realized she needed to call Declan. She had given him the gas station payphone number and arranged a call time that afternoon. She climbed out and walked to town at a half run and got there with 2 minutes to spare. He had filed for the restraining order. The grounds were solid, he said, documented harassment, intimidation, and the illegal use of a fixed-blade weapon to deliver correspondence on private property. The hearing was in 8 days. He had also been doing research on Apex Development Holdings, and what he had found was enough that he had asked a colleague in Sacramento to take a look at it. The structure of the company was more complex than the surface suggested, and the pattern of property acquisitions in the region had certain characteristics that warranted attention from people with more investigative resources than a solo practitioner in Barstow. He did not say more than that on the phone, but his voice had the particular quality of a person who has found something significant and is being careful about how he discusses it. "You're doing the right thing staying put," he said before he hung up. "Whatever they tell you, whatever they offer, stay put." She walked back to the barn in the late afternoon, the desert light going gold and amber around her, the Joshua trees beginning to throw their long shadows across the pale road. The restraining order was coming. Declan had something he was following. The seeds were growing in the dark earth beneath her feet. She went down into the greenhouse and sat in the soft, cool air among the new green things and breathed slowly, letting the day settle around her. She was still there when the stars came out above the polycarbonate panels, bright and clear and impossibly numerous in the dark Mojave sky. The restraining order came through on a Thursday morning, 8 days after Declan filed. He called the payphone at the arranged time and read her the terms in his precise, careful voice. Apex Development Holdings and its representatives were legally barred from entering the property, from making contact with Leah Vance by any means, and from engaging in any conduct reasonably construed as intimidation or harassment in relation to the parcel. The order had teeth. Violation would constitute contempt and could result in immediate civil liability. The judge had looked at the documented evidence, the knife in the doorframe, the surveillance, the escalating offers delivered through increasingly aggressive channels, and had not needed long to decide. Leah stood at the payphone and listened to Declan read the legal language and felt something in her chest that she identified after a moment as the absence of attention she had been carrying so long. She had stopped noticing it was there. "Thank you," she said when he finished. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "This is a speed bump, not a wall. People like this have lawyers too, and they'll look for another angle. Just stay alert." She walked back to the barn in the early morning light with the long shadows of the Joshua trees lying across the road. The sedan had not appeared on the dirt road in 11 days. The knife mark in the doorframe was still there. She had not filled it in. She had decided without thinking too hard about why that she wanted it to remain visible, a reminder of what she was dealing with and what she had not given ground to. The greenhouse was thriving. She went down the stairs each morning with the specific pleasure of someone who has built a thing and cannot quite stop marveling that it works. The lettuce had come up in dense, productive rows, the leaves dark green and crisp, with a vitality that seemed almost excessive, given the hostile environment 8 feet above them. The tomato plants were climbing the wire supports she had strung from the ceiling joists, the first small yellow flowers already open, and the carrot tops were a feathery green fringe along the eastern bed. Even the herbs which she had worried about had found their footing and were spreading low and fragrant across the soil. She had begun to understand the greenhouse in the way you understand a living system once you have spent enough time inside it. The temperature differential between morning and afternoon, the way the moisture collected on the underside of the panels in the early hours and ran down to the drainage channel. The particular quality of the diffused light at midday when the sun was directly overhead and came through the panels at maximum intensity and lit the whole interior with a brightness that was nothing like sunlight and everything like it. She had also begun to understand the barn itself in the way you understand a building when you have spent months living inside it and working on it. She had replaced 3 sections of the west wall where the structural members had rotted through. She had reinforced 2 of the main roof beams with sister boards bolted alongside them. She had patched a section of the tin roof with material salvaged from the fallen panels. The barn was not restored, not by any standard that would satisfy a building inspector, but it had stopped being a structure that might fall down and had become one that was standing intentionally, which was a different thing. The silence lasted 9 days after the restraining order was granted. Then the county notice arrived. It was not delivered by mail. It was posted to the barn door in the official manner of county code enforcement, a yellow form in a plastic sleeve, the kind of document that carries the weight of bureaucracy rather than the weight of a person. She read it standing in the doorframe, the morning sun at her back, the plastic sleeve warm in her hands. The citation listed 4 violations. The roof of the main structure did not meet current county building standards for occupied dwellings. The greenhouse addition had been constructed without the required permits. The access road did not meet minimum width requirements for residential structures. The rainwater collection system was not compliant with current state graywater regulations. She had 21 days to remediate or face a formal condemnation order. A condemnation order would render the property legally uninhabitable and could result in forced vacation pending structural review. She stood in the doorway and read the citation twice and understood immediately what it was. It was not the county acting on its own initiative. Nobody from the county had driven out to this remote parcel and walked around it in the months she had been working. There were no tire tracks in the road from any vehicle she had not already accounted for. The citations were technically accurate. She could not dispute that the roof did not meet code, and she had not pulled permits for the greenhouse, and the access road was exactly as narrow as it had always been. But the accuracy of the complaints was beside the point. The complaints had not come from concerned neighbors or diligent inspectors. They had come from people with access to a law firm and a knowledge of how county code enforcement worked, and the patience to use the system itself as a removal mechanism when direct intimidation had failed. Apex did not need to come to her land anymore. They had found a way to make the county come instead. She photographed the notice with a disposable camera she had bought at the gas station for exactly this kind of contingency. She photographed the door frame where it was posted, the date, the case number, all of it. Then she walked to the payphone and called Declan before she had reached the gas station. He listened to her read the citation in full. When she finished, there was a pause of several seconds. "This is them," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. Another pause. "Then they're not wrong about the technical violations. You know that." "I know." "Which means we can't fight the citation itself on its merits. We'd need to either remediate or challenge the process. Challenging the process means proving the complaint originated with Apex, which means discovery, which takes time we may not have. He was thinking out loud in the way that careful people think out loud, not uncertain, but processing. The 21 days is real. If you get a condemnation order before we can respond to it meaningfully, they can seek a court order requiring you to vacate while the property is under review. That could take months. And the land sits empty again, Leah said. And the land sits empty again, Declan confirmed, which is what they want. He paused again. I need to accelerate some things I've been looking into. There may be a way to take this in a different direction. Can you give me 48 hours? Yes, she said. Don't let anyone onto the property in the meantime. If a county inspector shows up, you are legally within your rights to request that they schedule a formal appointment with notice. Do that and document everything. She hung up and stood at the payphone for a moment. Around her, the ordinary business of Amboy continued, which was to say very little. A truck pulling into the gas station, a dog sleeping in the shade of the abandoned motel, small and unhurried. The kind of stillness that felt different now than it had when she first arrived, less empty and more settled, the quiet of a place that had decided what it was. She walked back to the barn. She did not dig that afternoon. She inspected the barn roof instead, working methodically from one end to the other, making a list of what needed attention. The sections of sagging decking, the places where the sister board she had installed needed additional fastening, the two ridge cap sections that had lost their ceiling compound and let in water during the last rain. The roof was salvageable. It was not in compliance, but it was salvageable, and there was a difference between those two things that she intended to make visible to anyone who cared to look carefully. She started on the most critical section that evening and worked by headlamp until midnight. Declan called 41 hours later. She was on the roof when she heard the payphone through the open barn doors, and she came down fast and ran the half-mile to town and picked it up on the 10th ring. I need to tell you what I found, he said, and I need you to understand that this is considerably larger than a property dispute. She stood at the payphone and listened. He had spent the week since their first conversation building a picture of Apex Development Holdings from the outside in, using public records, court filings, corporate registration databases, and the help of a colleague in Sacramento who worked primarily on financial crime. What they had assembled was a structure of considerable complexity, 9 shell companies arranged in a layered hierarchy with Apex at the visible surface, and the actual ownership buried 4 levels down in a chain of entities registered across 3 states and 2 offshore jurisdictions. The pattern of property acquisitions was the key. Over 22 years, the network connected to Apex had acquired 37 parcels in the desert regions of California, Nevada, and Arizona, paying cash always below assessed value, always in remote areas with poor road access and minimal neighboring development. None of the parcels had been developed. No resort had been built. No project had broken ground anywhere. The land sat and the companies that owned it sat, and nothing visible happened. The FBI field office in Sacramento had been aware of the network for 2 years, Declan said carefully. They had been building a case around the pattern of acquisitions and the financial flows that connected the shell companies. The case was substantially advanced, but it had a gap in it, a physical gap. The network required physical storage infrastructure locations where certain materials and financial instruments could be held outside the banking system and outside any address that could be connected to the network's principals. The investigators had identified 11 locations that fit the profile. 10 had been vacated or were accessible for examination. The 11th was a parcel in San Bernardino County, her grandfather's land. The parcel had been in legal limbo for 8 years after the registered owner's death, Declan said. No heir had come forward, and the estate had been handled by a law firm that had managed the deed transfer to a minor's trust and then gone dormant, waiting for the beneficiary to reach majority. During that 8 years, the network had continued using the physical infrastructure on the property without any legal authority to do so. When Leah had appeared and filed the deed transfer, and begun occupying the land. She had introduced a complication the network had not anticipated and had tried to resolve first through the offer and pressure campaign, and when that failed, through the code violation strategy. The code violations, Declan said, were actually a tactical mistake on their part. Filing formal complaints created a paper trail connecting Apex's legal representatives to the property at a time when the FBI was already aware of the network. His colleague in Sacramento had flagged the complaint filing to the federal investigators, and it had accelerated their timeline. The FBI, Declan said, wanted to speak with her. Not as a suspect, he added immediately, as a property owner was standing to grant access to the structure on her land that they believed contained materials relevant to their investigation. They needed either her consent or a warrant, and a warrant would take longer and create more noise, and they preferred to move quietly and quickly before Apex realized the investigation had reached this location. She absorbed this for a moment. "What's in the bunker?" she said. "We don't know exactly," Declan said. "Financial instruments, most likely, possibly currency, documents. The network has operated primarily as a money laundering infrastructure, moving funds through the property acquisition chain and extracting them through a system of loans and repayments between the connected entities. The physical materials would be the core records that make the whole system legible. Without them, the case has structural weaknesses. With them, it becomes something else entirely." She thought about her grandfather in the last year of his life, sick and determined, digging the space that now held the center of a federal investigation. She thought about what he had known and what he had not known, and what he had done with the knowledge he had. She thought about Sarge Briggs, whose debt had started all of it. "When do they want to come?" she said. Declan arrived 2 days later with a woman named Special Agent Carla Moss from the Sacramento field office and 2 other agents whose names Leah did not retain. They came in 2 vehicles, both unmarked and unremarkable, and they parked at the side of the barn out of sight of the road. Agent Moss was compact and direct, with the focused economy of someone who had been doing complex work for a long time and had learned to spend her energy precisely. She shook Leah's hand and looked at the barn and the greenhouse site and the cleared land around it with a brief, comprehensive attention. Leah led them inside. She walked to the back corner and moved the salvage lumber herself, piece by piece, stacking it to the side. The agents watched without offering to help, and she did not ask them to. This was her barn and her floor and her grandfather's secret, and she was going to be the one to uncover it. When she had cleared the opening, she stood back and looked down at the concrete stairs and the steel door at the bottom, and the industrial deadbolt that someone had installed after her grandfather's 20-year agreement had expired. There it was, months of weight sitting under her, the bunker she had known was under her feet and had covered and left alone because she did not want to know, and because knowing would have required deciding what to do about it before she was ready. She was ready now. Agent Moss came forward and looked down. She said something quietly to one of the other agents, and he produced a device from his kit and went down the stairs. The lock was defeated in less than 4 minutes. The door opened. The cold, stale air that came up was the same cold she had felt the first time she had looked down here. The cold of a sealed space, but underneath it was something else now. The metallic, slightly sweet smell of old paper and preserved materials. The smell of things that had been kept for a long time in the expectation of eventually being needed. Leah stood at the top of the stairs while the agents went down. She could hear them moving in the space below, the sound of equipment, the occasional exchange of clipped professional language. She looked at the wall of the barn, at the rough wood, and the gaps in the boards where thin lines of morning light came through. She thought about her grandfather standing in this exact spot, or near it, in the last year of his life, having just finished the thing he had built, and knowing what it would be used for, and carrying that knowledge forward into whatever time he had left. She heard one of the agents say something with a different quality to it, and then Agent Moss's voice responding, and then footsteps on the stairs, and Moss appeared in the opening with something in her hand. It was an envelope, sealed white, and on the front, in the handwriting that Leah now knew as well as her own, her name. Leah Vance. The letters were steadier than in the last letter she had found, which meant it had been written earlier when his hands were better. He had planned this. He had sealed a letter in the wall of the bunker he had built for criminals, knowing that the only people who would ever open that door legitimately were law enforcement. Knowing that if law enforcement opened it, there was a reason, and that reason meant the thing he had set in motion had reached its conclusion. He had put her name on an envelope and hidden it in the wall as a message to a girl who would be a woman by the time she read it. She went down the stairs. The bunker was larger than she had imagined from the diagram. The concrete walls were solid and clean, her grandfather's work, and the ceiling was high enough to stand in comfortably. The space was divided by a low partition into two sections. In the first section were metal shelving units holding plastic storage containers, the kind with locking lids stacked 4 high. In the second section were two large steel document safes bolted to the floor. Agent Moss was standing near the partition with her hands at her sides, watching Leah take in the space. "There's a lot here," Moss said simply. Leah looked at the shelves and the safes and the clean, solid walls her grandfather had built and said nothing for a long moment. She held the envelope. Moss looked at it. "I'll give you a minute," she said, and moved back toward the stairs. Leah sat down on the concrete floor with her back against her grandfather's wall and opened the letter. His handwriting in this one was the careful, deliberate script of the earlier letters, controlled and precise, and she understood that he had written it years before he died and had come back here to place it in the wall. He had planned this the way he had planned everything connected to this land in layers, with contingencies, thinking about what might happen and what he needed to say for each possibility. "My dearest Leah," he began, "if you are reading this letter, it means you found the Wallapini diagram and you built what I asked you to build. It means you stayed when they told you to go. It means you chose the harder right the way I asked you to and the way I always believed you would, even though I could not be there to see it. I need to tell you about Earl Briggs. I told you in the other letters that I built this place to save Earl's life. That is true, but there is more to it than that, and you deserve to know all of it. Earl Briggs is not only the man I saved, he is also the man who made this place matter. When Earl came to me and told me about the trouble he was in, he told me the full shape of it. He told me who these men were and what they did and how the structure of it worked. He told me more than I had any right to know and more than was safe for him to tell anyone. I asked him why he was telling me, and he said, because you're the only honest man I know, and I need someone honest to know this in case something happens to me. He had been keeping records. From the beginning, from the first time he had been drawn into the network's orbit, he had been writing things down. Names, dates, amounts, locations. He had a record going back years of every transaction he had witnessed or participated in, and every instruction he had received from the men who ran the network. He kept the records in the way that a man keeps records when he knows the records are the only insurance he has, carefully and in multiple locations and in a form that could be understood by someone who did not already know the context. He gave me the records when the deal was made. He said, keep these somewhere. They will never be found, and somewhere they will be found if they need to be. I built a space into this wall for them. The records are in the wall cavity behind the third shelf unit on the eastern side. They have been there since the beginning. I do not know if these records will ever be needed. I hope the men honor the agreement and disappear in 2016, and the records sit in this wall until the building eventually falls down and nobody ever needs to know. But I did not think that was the most likely outcome. I thought the most likely outcome was that men like this do not walk away from something useful simply because an agreement says they should. I thought they would stay, and I thought one day someone would need to know what Earl Briggs recorded. If law enforcement is in this building with you, then that day has come. Give them what they need. You are not implicated in any of this. Your name appears nowhere in any of these records, and your connection to this land is that of an heir who arrived as an adult and acted correctly throughout. You have nothing to fear from telling the truth. There is one more thing. The dirty money, the $10,000. I have thought about this more than anything else in the time I have been writing these letters to you, and I want to be honest about what I believe. I believe that money used the way I asked you to use it to build something that creates life is clean. The thing that makes money dirty is not where it comes from but what it becomes. If you have built what I drew for you, then you have already understood this better than I could explain it. Keep the greenhouse, keep the land. What you have built there is yours by every measure that matters. He wrote about the land for two more paragraphs about what he had seen in it when he bought it and what he had hoped for it and what he believed it could become in the hands of someone patient enough to let it. Then the letter moved to something else. I have a photograph of you that I have kept next to my bed since the year you were born. You are 4 years old in it, and you are sitting on the step of your mother's apartment building, and you are looking at something off to the side with an expression that I have always thought of as the purest version of who you are. Not happy exactly, but completely present, completely yourself. No performance, no adjustment for whoever is watching, just you looking at the world with those clear eyes and deciding what you think about it. Earl has that photograph. I gave it to him for safekeeping because I was afraid your mother might lose everything I had left at her apartment, and Earl was reliable in ways your mother was not. If Earl is still alive when this is over, and I believe he will come to find you. He will know when it is time, because the news will reach him one way or another, and Earl always knew when it was time. When he comes, be kind to him. He made choices I would not have made, and he has carried the weight of them longer than is good for any person to carry something like that. But he was loyal to me in the way that matters most, which is that he told me the truth when the truth was dangerous to tell. Not many people will do that. It is worth something. I built them a place to hide. I trusted you to build a place where nothing needs to hide anymore. The letter ended there. She sat on the floor of the bunker her grandfather had built for criminals and read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her shirt pocket and stood up. She went to the third shelf unit on the eastern wall and found the cavity behind it, a section of the concrete that was not concrete, but a panel faced with concrete-colored plaster fitted into the wall so precisely that you would not know it was there unless you knew to look. She pressed on it, and it moved. Behind it was a metal document box, the same vintage as the ammunition box under the floorboard, and it was heavy with paper. She carried it to Agent Moss. There are records in here, she said. They were placed here by a man named Earl Briggs. He documented the network's operations over a period of years. The person who built this space held on to them for him. Moss took the box without visible surprise, as if she had been expecting that something like this was possible. She looked at Leah for a long moment. Your grandfather built this space, she said. It was not quite a question. He did, Leah said. Moss nodded slowly. I'm sorry you're in the middle of this, she said. None of this is your doing. I know, Leah said, but it's my land. She went upstairs while the agents worked. She stood in the barn and looked at the morning light coming through the gaps in the boards and listened to the sounds from below and thought about Walter Vance in the last year of his life, sick and alone in this desert building, things he hoped would matter after he was gone. They mattered. Marcus Shear was arrested at the international terminal of McCarran Airport in Las Vegas on a Thursday evening, 17 days after Leah signed the cooperation agreement with the FBI. She was in the greenhouse when Declan called with the news, harvesting the first full heads of lettuce from the beds she had planted in the early weeks when pressing seeds into the dark soil had felt like a gesture of faith she was not entirely sure she believed in yet. She climbed out of the greenhouse and walked to the payphone with dirt on her hands and her pockets full of lettuce. Declan told her that the arrests had been coordinated across 3 jurisdictions simultaneously, that 7 individuals connected to the network had been taken into custody, and that the financial instruments and records recovered from the bunker had provided the evidentiary foundation that made the prosecution viable. The code violation lawsuit Apex had filed against her property had been withdrawn. The company itself was in the process of being dissolved as part of the asset seizure proceedings. She stood at the payphone and listened to all of this. How are you doing? Declan said when he had finished the formal account. He said it in a different register, the way people say it when they actually want to know. She thought about it for a moment. I'm okay, she said. I think I'm more than okay. You should be, he said. What you did here took a particular kind of courage. Most people would have taken the money and left. Nobody would have blamed them. My grandfather didn't leave, she said. No, Declan said quietly. He didn't. She walked back to the barn in the afternoon light, the Mojave going through its transformation, the hard brightness of midday giving way to something richer and more complicated, deep gold and amber in the horizontal light, the Joshua trees casting their long shadows eastward across the pale earth. She was on the roof of the barn 3 days later, completing the last section of tin work that had been waiting since before she arrived, when she heard a vehicle on the dirt road. Not the sedan. Something older, a truck from the sound of it with a diesel engine that announced its approach from a considerable distance. She climbed down and stood at the corner of the barn and watched it come. It was a pickup truck 20 years old, at least the kind of truck that had been used for actual work and wore the evidence of it in its dented panels and faded paint. It came slowly up the road and stopped 20 feet from the barn, and a man got out. He was 74 years old. She would learn this later. He moved the way men of that age move when they have lived hard but not carelessly, with a deliberateness that said each motion was considered before it was made. He was not tall, but he was solidly built, wide in the shoulders, and he wore a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt and boots that had been resoled at least once. His hair was white and cut short, and his face had the deep-line quality of someone who had spent the better part of a life outdoors in weather. He stood next to his truck and looked at her. She stood at the corner of the barn and looked at him. Leah Vance, he said. His voice was low and even, and she could hear something in it that was working to stay even. Yes, she said. He exhaled slowly. You look like him, he said, around the eyes. She understood who he was before he told her. She had been expecting him, or someone like him, since she had read the letter in the bunker. Still hearing it confirmed had a weight to it. Earl Briggs, he said. Your grandfather called me Sarge. I expect he told you about me. He told me, she said. They stood there for a moment in the afternoon light, two people taking the measure of each other across a distance that was more than the physical space between them. I heard about Shear, he said. Heard about the arrests. I've been following it since the beginning, soon as I knew you were here. I told myself I'd come when it was finished. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and produced something small and flat. He held it for a moment before he crossed the distance between them and extended it toward her. It was a photograph. Old, the color slightly faded in the way of photographs from the early 2000s, before everything went digital. A little girl of 4 sitting on a concrete step looking at something to the left of the camera with an expression of total unself-conscious attention. Dark eyes, a small serious face, wisps of hair across her forehead. Next to the little girl sitting on the same step with his large carpenter's hand resting on the concrete beside her without quite touching her was a man in a flannel shirt. She had no memory of this moment. She had been 4 years old, and some memories from that age are kept, and some are lost. And this one had been lost, or had never formed in the way that memories form, had been experienced and then submerged into the wordless archive of very early childhood, where things are felt but not stored in any form that can be retrieved. But there he was, and there she was, on a step somewhere in the California she had grown up in, two people who belonged to each other sitting in the afternoon sun, both of them looking at something outside the frame with the same particular quality of attention. He kept it all this time, Earl said. Showed it to me maybe a year before he died. Said he thought about you every single day. Said he'd made provision, and he believed you'd find your way to it. He looked at her directly. I told him he was putting a lot of faith in an 8-year-old girl. What did he say, she asked. Earl made a sound that was something between a laugh and something older than a laugh. He said she comes from good stock. He said she'll be fine. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at the man in the flannel shirt and the small girl sitting beside him on the step. Both of them looking at something outside the frame, and she thought about the years between that step and this dirt road. All the years the photograph had been traveling toward her through the hands of a man who had known her grandfather and kept faith with what he had asked him to keep. She handed it back to Earl. Keep it, he said immediately. No, she said. She held his gaze steadily. You kept it for him. You should have it. He looked at her and something moved through his expression that was difficult to name, something that had been waiting a long time to find a place to settle. Then he folded the photograph carefully and put it back in his breast pocket. She made coffee on the camp stove, the small domestic act feeling both incongruous and exactly right in the large space of the barn, and they sat on salvage lumber and she let him talk. He talked about Walter, about what they had been to each other across 50 years of intermittent contact, about the specific quality of loyalty that develops between people who have been through something together and have chosen not to waste it. He talked about the records he had kept and why the decision he had made early, that if he was going to be inside something he could not get out of, he was going to document it completely because documentation was the only form of integrity available to him in that situation. He talked about the weight of carrying that over the years and about what it meant to him that the weight was now lifted. He did not ask her to forgive him for his part in what her grandfather had been drawn into. She noticed the absence of that and respected it. He was not here for absolution. He was here because Walter had asked him to come in a letter that had been sitting in a bunker wall, and because Earl Briggs honored what he had committed to honor. Before he left, he stood at the entrance to the greenhouse and looked down the stairs at the growing beds below. The afternoon light was falling through the polycarbonate panels at the angle that made everything inside appear lit from within, the lettuce rows luminous, the tomato plants climbing their wire supports with a quiet insistence. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he drew you a plan for this. She nodded. He shook his head slowly. That old man, he said. He said it the way people say things when they mean more than the words. Earl Briggs drove away down the dirt road in his old diesel truck, and she watched until the dust settled behind him and the sound of the engine faded into the general silence of the desert. And then there was nothing but the wind and the stillness, and the faint smell of the coffee still warming on the camp stove. She went inside and sat at the workbench she had built from salvage lumber and opened her notebook to a clean page. She sat there for a while without writing anything, looking at the blank paper and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The office with the burnt coffee smell, the Greyhound bus, the brass key, the first stroke of the shovel into desert hardpan, the letters, the growing things in the dark. She set up her produce stand on the second Saturday of the following month, a folding table borrowed from Willa Avery placed at the edge of the library's small parking area, with a hand-lettered sign that said Vance Farm in block letters above it. She had 3 varieties of lettuce, 3 pounds of cherry tomatoes that were genuinely better than anything available at the gas station refrigerator case, a bundle of carrots still feathery with their tops, and 4 varieties of fresh herbs in small paper bags. She had priced everything simply and honestly. Willa Avery was there at 7 in the morning before the stand was even fully set up, examining the lettuce with the practical eye of someone who had grown up knowing what good produce looked like. She bought 2 heads and a bag of basil and said it was the best basil she had encountered in years, which Leah thought might be a slight exaggeration, but accepted in the spirit it was offered. Gareth Holt arrived at 8. He walked around the table slowly, looking at everything without touching it, in the manner of a man who had grown up in an era when you examined things carefully before you committed. He picked up a bunch of carrots. He looked at the root ends and the tops, and he set them down, and then he picked up a tomato and pressed it gently and smelled it. He bought everything she had left on the table. She started to say something about other customers coming, and he cut her off with a look that said he was not doing her a favor and did not want to be treated as if he was. He was buying produce because the produce was good. That was the entire transaction. He paid what the sign said, and he loaded everything into his truck bed, and he drove away without a backward look. She sold out before 10 o'clock. The following Saturday, she brought twice as much and sold that too. By the third Saturday, she had a list of regular customers that had grown without any particular effort on her part, simply by people tasting things and telling other people about what they had tasted. The elementary school's cafeteria supervisor had called her the Monday after the second Saturday about a standing weekly order. The owner of the gas station, who had watched from his doorway for 3 consecutive Saturdays, with the expression of a man conducting a study, crossed the road and bought everything she had in the herb category. A retired couple who lived 20 miles out in the desert in a house they had built themselves came specifically for the lettuce because the woman had a health condition that required fresh greens, and they had been driving 40 minutes for them until now. They stayed and talked for an hour on their first visit and came back every week after that. She was not making large amounts of money, but she was making real money that had a clean line between the work and the result money that felt entirely different from the cashier's check that had been waiting for her in Ms. Drummond's office, which had come from the state and had the quality of something owed rather than something earned. Declan called with a final substantive update on a Tuesday morning when she was in the greenhouse working on the second planning cycle. The federal case was proceeding to trial, and the evidence package from the bunker had proven, in the words of the lead prosecutor, comprehensive and devastating. Her testimony would not be required in person, as she was not a direct witness to any criminal activity, only to the events surrounding the property, and those events were amply documented in the record. The cooperation framework for affected property owners was being finalized. The compensation figure, he said, was in the range of $50,000 to $70,000. Standard framework for cooperating property owners in federal asset forfeiture cases involving their land. He said it the way he said everything, precisely and without embellishment, but she could hear something underneath it. That's enough to run a water line from the county road, she said, and make the barn properly weather-tight before winter. Maybe start the second greenhouse bay in spring. Yes, he said. It is. She thanked him. She meant it in a way that was hard to put into words, not just for the legal work, but for the steadiness of him throughout the way he had approached her situation as a problem that had a solution and had worked methodically toward the solution without ever suggesting that she should do anything other than exactly what she had chosen to do. After she hung up, she stood at the payphone for a moment, looking at the ordinary street of Amboy, the gas station and the abandoned motel, and the library in the back of the town hall, and the long, pale road going in both directions into the desert. She had arrived here with a backpack and a key and no plan beyond the one her grandfather had left her in a box under a floorboard. She had not known anyone. She had not known how to do any of the things she had needed to do. She had learned them one at a time in the order she needed them, the way you learn things when there is no alternative to learning them. She thought she would probably go on learning things in that order for a long time. That seemed right to her. In the days that followed, she made two things with her hands. The first was the second greenhouse bay. She excavated it using everything the first build had taught her, putting in the drainage trench before she had dug more than 2 feet deep, reading the soil composition as she went, and adjusting her approach when the northeast corner showed the same clay-heavy composition that had given her trouble the first time. She built the walls with the additional insulation on the north face that the first winter had shown her was necessary, and she modified the roof pitch by 3 degrees based on the light distribution patterns she had observed through the seasons. The second build took less time than the first, not because she worked faster, but because she made fewer mistakes, and fewer mistakes meant less time spent undoing things and doing them again. She was in the second excavation 8 feet down when she understood something about the work that she had not been able to articulate before. The first time she had dug this deep, she had been afraid. Not of anything specific, not of the ground or the labor or the isolation, but of the larger thing underneath all of those smaller things, the fear that she was wrong to stay wrong, to believe that what her grandfather had left her was worth what it was costing her to keep it. She had kept going in spite of that fear, which was a kind of courage, but it was the scared kind, the white-knuckle kind. This time there was no fear underneath the work. There was only the work which was difficult and specific and hers to do, and the knowledge of what would follow from doing it correctly. That felt like a different kind of thing altogether. Not the absence of fear, but the replacement of it with something more useful. She finished the excavation in 12 days. She built the walls in 9. She installed the roof panels in 3, and when she sealed the last panel and came down the stairs, and stood in the new space and felt the temperature differential close around her like something physical. She sat down on the earthen floor and let herself be still for a long time. The second thing she made required less labor, but more time. She had been saving pieces of the old barn wood since her first week at the property, the sections she had removed during repairs that were still structurally sound, despite their weathering the beautiful silver-gray timber that decades of Mojave sun had worked into something that had no equivalent in anything you could buy at a lumberyard. It was wood that had a history written into it, not in words, but in the density of the grain and the depth of the color, and the way it felt under her hands, substantial and patient. The wood of something that had stood its ground in a hard place for a long time. She sorted through the pieces she had accumulated over the months and selected the one that was the right size and the right character. A plank from the original barn door, wide and solid, and marked by its years in the way that things of quality are marked, with an accumulation of depth rather than a deterioration. She used a chisel from Gareth Holt's store and a technique she had found in a woodworking book from Willa Avery's library, a book published in 1974 that had been checked out 3 times in the 4 decades since its acquisition, according to the card in the back pocket. And that described letter carving in the direct practical language of someone who assumed the reader wanted to actually do the thing rather than simply understand it theoretically. Leah read the relevant chapter twice before she picked up the chisel. It took her 4 evenings of careful work. She made mistakes in the first hour, testing the chisel angle and the depth, and she corrected them and continued. The letters required patience because carving letters was different from cutting them. The pressure needed to be consistent, and the angle needed to stay true, and the transitions between strokes needed to be made decisively, or the wood would split in the wrong direction. Patience had never been her scarcest quality. When it was done, she set it on the workbench and looked at it in the headlamp light. Vance. 5 letters in the wood of the barn her grandfather had bought in 1996, with a retirement plan that never materialized, and a hope that took 28 years to arrive at its destination. The same 5 letters stenciled on the ammunition box under the floorboard, where everything had started. Her name and his name, and the name of the people who had come before both of them, running backward through time, to wherever the line began, to whoever the first person was who had decided that this was who they were, and passed it forward. She carried the plank to the main barn door and hung it above the entrance with 2 lag bolts set into the frame using the level she had bought in the spring to get it straight. She stepped back and looked at it. The Mojave at first light the next morning was different from the Mojave at any other hour. The darkness pulled back from the east in gradations, charcoal to gray to a pale silver, that preceded the sun by 20 minutes and gave everything in that interval a quality of suspension, as if the world were deciding what color to be. The barn cast no shadow yet. The greenhouse door was slightly ajar, the way she always left it at night for ventilation, and the faint warmth of the growing space inside drifted out into the cold desert air like something alive and breathing. Leah stood in front of her barn in the gray pre-dawn and looked at her grandfather's name above the door and let herself inhabit the moment without trying to make anything of it, without turning it into something larger than it already was, which was already quite large. She thought about the man who had sat at a table somewhere in the last year of his dying and written letters to a girl he would not live to see grow up, assembling a future for her from what he had available. A piece of dirt, a diagram, $10,000 of money he was ashamed of. The conviction that she would choose correctly when the choice was presented to her. She thought about the morning she had read his last note and decided to stay. The moment at the edge of the hole when the easy path was still available and she had chosen not to take it. The seeds going into the dark earth on faith, the water in the cistern, the slow, patient accumulation of growing things in the space she had built from his diagram. She thought about Earl Briggs driving away in his old diesel truck with the photograph in his breast pocket, and about Walter's voice in letters she had now read so many times that she could reconstruct any passage from memory. Not as an exercise, but because they had become part of the structure of how she thought, the way the things that matter to us become part of how we think, whether we intend them to or not. I built them a place to hide. I trusted you to build a place where nothing needs to hide anymore. She looked at the greenhouse entrance, the simple wooden door at the top of the stairs slightly ajar, and through it, the soft, diffused light of the growing space below, where the second planting of the second bay was already 3 weeks old and showing exactly the kind of vigor she had learned to expect from soil prepared with the care it deserved. In an hour, she would go down and check the new planting and do the work that the day required, as she had done every morning since the first green point of a lettuce seedling had pushed up through the dark Mojave soil, and told her in the only language available to it that this place could sustain life if life was willing to do its part. She had done her part, she was still doing it. The sun cleared the horizon in a long horizontal line of pale gold, and the desert came into its colors all at once. The ochre and the rust and the rose and the bone white of the dry road running north and south. And the Joshua trees stood in their strange, patient postures against the brightening sky and cast their shadows westward in the early light. Leah Vance stood in front of the barn her grandfather had bought with nothing but faith and passed on with nothing but love. And she looked at her name above the door, and she breathed the cold, clean air of the Mojave at dawn, and she stayed.